I am incredibly excited to have the opportunity to conduct this interview with Peter. I've loved gallery books. I still love them. And they're a big part of what first drew me to Ireland. My own story of coming here involved reading Irish language poetry, which then led me to study the Irish language. And now I am a citizen, and I could not have predicted my life taking any of these directions. And although I'm now published by Gallery, much of the story of the press and the history of the press remains a mystery to me. Some of it took place before I was born. So as part of a new generation of gallery writers, I just feel really excited to have some insight into that story. And it's also really unusual to get to sit down with somebody who's devoted 55 years of their life to doing the same job and doing it extraordinarily well, and to building an institution that's gone straight to the heart of the culture. So without further ado, I thought we would start right at the beginning. Peter, as Emer said, you founded the Gallery Press when you were 18 years old, after running a literary magazine, if I have this right, called Capella, in which I understand Irish writers were extremely excited to see their names published alongside the likes of Allen Ginsberg and David Bowie and John Lennon, if I have that right?
Not Bowie.
Sorry, I'll hand you...
I don't know who started that
rumor. Okay. We'll get some clarifications tonight as well.
I think it was Jim Fitzpatrick, who's... do I need a mic? Can you hear me?
Not right now, just maybe the music.
Okay, if my backing band gets louder, we'll use the mic. But if we don't, it'll be easier. Jim Fitzpatrick was a visual artist in a sort of mix of pop art and Celtic mysticism. As Grace said, I did start my endeavors in literary activities when I was young. So that's my excuse, basically. And there were people who helped. In particular, there was a man called Eamon Carr, whom I met. He was older than I, and he'd been around the block a bit. And I left school, a boarding school, when I was 16. I bounced down to Trinity thinking, I know what I want to do, and they must be delighted that I'm here. And they said, go away, you're too young. And what I wanted to be was a veterinary surgeon. So I started a pre-university science course, and I had already started writing something, but I didn't know what it was, because honestly, I didn't think anybody wrote poems. And then I met Eamon Carr and friends of his, and they talked about poems. And I said, what do you mean, poems? And they showed me, and I said, well, I have things that I think are like that. And they said, these are poems. And they started to send them out to magazines and newspapers and things. And they started getting published. They were awful, by the way. They were really awful. But Eamon and I started working together, and we started this series of what would now be called open mic sessions. We rented a room up in Parnell Square. Every 2 weeks, people could come, sign in a book if they wanted to read. And we would have a guest poet each session and a musician. And after a while, it struck us that there were voices emerging, and the work they were doing should have a life beyond these sessions, and publication was a natural thing, but where would they get published? So we started a magazine. And that was started really out of the reading sessions. And then we invited different people to contribute. Some songwriters, not Bowie, but some. And after a while, several issues of the magazine, it seemed some people were emerging to another level, and there was a natural next step for them, which was kind of book publication. But we looked around and there weren't book publishers, and I thought, well, there was one very distinguished publisher, I have to say, called the Dublin Press, and their books were very handsome and beautifully designed and very expensive, and they seemed sort of beyond the audience that we were building. And we started gallery books, or I started gallery books between issues of Capella at the beginning. I don't know if you could do something like that now, because I went into a printer and I said, will you print these, and when I've sold them, I'll pay you. And he said, okay. And it was extraordinary. I mean, we sold some copies of the magazine and the early books in bookshops, but people would come to the readings, and a lot of them were kids in school, and they would take copies and they'd bring them to their school and sell them and come 2 weeks later and give us money. I mean, it was a kind of underground thing, and it worked. And then I did go to Trinity, and within a couple of years I was publishing 2 of my professors, which I thought was a pretty clever move. It didn't turn out to be that clever for me, actually. But to my delight, I continued to publish one of them, and she is one of our great poets, Elaine Killinan. I'm seeing her tomorrow to finalize her new selected poems, 53 years after I published her first book. Boy, that's a long answer.
That's a great answer.
I'll get to yes or no.
The multiple choice are coming. You were talking about the Dolman books and how beautiful they were, and having so much admiration for them. And I know the arts community in Ireland recently mourned the loss of Michael Caine, whose artworks graced the cover of, I think it was nearly 100 gallery books, if that's right, and whose woodcuts, etchings, and are they lino cuts?
Yeah.
Became a signature of gallery books, and who designed the typeface that have become a hallmark of a gallery book. A few years ago, the Royal Hibernian Academy also held an exhibition called Cover Versions of all the sculptures, paintings, drawings that have appeared on gallery books. And I'm wondering, how did the press's connection with visual art emerge, and what is its significance?
Michael Caine was a terrific, bold, graphic artist. And I had the good fortune of bumping into him one day on O'Connell Bridge. And I mentioned that I was about to publish 3 books, and would he think about providing artwork for the covers? And he said, yes. And quickly, his work became associated with the press. And for a long time, he was the principal cover artist on the books. And sometimes he would do a design for a book in which he would cut an image, but he was also cut in wood or lino the title of the book and maybe the artist's name. And after a few years, I just had this idea, and I thought, there's something very repetitive about that. And what if you cut an alphabet? And I said to him, would you cut an alphabet, a woodcut alphabet for us? So he did, and we have ever since used it on all of our books. And whether the cover of a book is a photograph or a modern sculpture or old master's painting, it has this woodcut lettering. And I'm told subliminally people recognize it as a gallery book because of this. And you mentioned the Cover Versions exhibition. That was meant to happen 5 years ago. And I wanted Michael's contribution to the early years especially to be a feature. And I suddenly said to him, you know, if we had the original block, wouldn't it be amazing? And he said, well, I don't know where that is. And then the exhibition didn't happen at that time because of the plague, but it happened 2 or 3 years ago. But in the meantime, Michael rang me one day and he said, is that exhibition ever going to happen? Because I found the block. And I said, I'll be around. Can I see it? Can I get it to put in it? And I realized I'd never seen it before. He had given me at the time a print of it, and we had always worked from the print. And it's an absolutely stunning artwork in itself, just a block with the alphabet on it, cut without error, because he'd have had to start again. We were very fortunate that that meeting happened, and the design of the books is something that I take an interest in because of a particular interest I have as well in visual art, in particular in painting. But I'm entirely self-taught in almost everything, but especially in design. Now, an easy one.
An easy one. I want to jump ahead to asking you a little bit about publishing Irish language poetry. As I shared, it was Nuala Ní Gonal's books who first introduced me to the gallery press, the Irish language, coming to Ireland. You're all welcome. There's plenty of seats if you don't want to stand at the back. And in particular, it was reading Nuala's poem, The Language Issue, in which she compares writing in Irish to placing something dearly loved into a basket and floating it downstream in the hopes that it will wind up in the lap of some pharaoh's daughter. And I wanted to ask you, as a press that publishes poetry in Irish and in translation, where do you feel that baby has landed? And what has been the role of the press in connecting poetry written in Irish with audiences who mightn't ordinarily encounter such work?
You weren't listening at all when I said an easy one. The language issue of me publishing Irish is complicated by the fact that many people here will say they have better Irish than they really have. I think that's a truism. I probably have better Irish than I admit, which is the opposite. But I don't have the confidence in myself to really edit Irish in the way that I hope I can be a help as an editor and reader of English. So I'm at a loss, though I have ventured into publishing Irish language. And it started with a book that was completely in Irish by a poet called Michael Hartnett, who 50 years ago declared in public that he was saying farewell to English. And he published a book called A Farewell to English, and said he was only going to write in the Irish language from then on. And soon after that, I published a book by him that was his first Irish poems. But later, Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill emerged, and there was a lot of talk about Nuala, a lot of interest in Nuala, and a lot of people were beginning to translate Nuala. And I just thought, what about gathering translations that were out there by her and see how they hung together, and then inviting some other translators or some of the translators to do more. And we put together a book called Pharaoh's Daughter, a bilingual book, which I think sort of paved the way for her international reputation, which was unheard of for an Irish language poet. But it also created another kind of problem, because suddenly we were approached by people from Romania or Japan or somewhere saying, can we publish an edition of Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill's work in translation? And we realized they were basically translating the English. So they were translations of translations. And often, particularly at the beginning, the translations of Nuala were, let's say, loose and free. And Paul Muldoon, brilliant, totally brilliant, was inventive and more with some of her poems. But then subsequently we published a bilingual book by him of Nuala's poems, and then another. And by the second of his bilingual books, it's very interesting to see how faithful he is to her work in that. I mean, he's come kind of full circle from the early swashbuckling adventure of some of the poems in Pharaoh's Daughter. But we continue to issue bilingual books from time to time, though I have said I won't publish Irish language books. And there are options for Irish language poets now. So they can publish books in Irish, and then from time to time we will publish selections bilingually, which has the possibility of extending the readership for those authors. Most seem to be women, actually. I think. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So for the next question, I guess I'm wondering about this, particularly coming from a US context where so many of the great poets I know change publisher multiple times over the course of their careers, and bringing out a first book, having the opportunity to bring out a second with the same publisher is often not even an option for many poets on the other side of the pond. And I'm struck by how many gallery poets have been with the press either for the entirety of their careers or nearly so. And I'm wondering if you think this sort of sustained professional relationship changes the practice of writers in any way. For example, if whether or not the book will be published isn't as much of a question, do you think writers are facilitated to take more risks or pursue new directions in their practices that they mightn't ordinarily?
Well, let me make a point that I think is important. I actually think publishing is easy and anybody could do it. But I don't think editing is. And I hope if I have a gift, it is as an editor. And particularly in the decision about taking on someone's first book, it is either out of a conviction in the achievement of that book, the accomplishment that's evident, or in the promise that I feel in that book. So if I take on to publish someone, it isn't for one book, it is with a hope that a relationship will continue and that I will become that person's publisher over, take Elaine, over a lifetime. Of course, some leave and there are all kinds of reasons for that. Some I have to let go, and there are disappointments and there are reliefs. I mean, there are all those complicated responses to what happens. Next month here, we will publish a book by a man whose first 4 books I published. And then he came to me and said that he, with a heavy heart, was going to publish his 5th book with an English publisher. He's based in Scotland, his life is in Scotland. He thought it made sense. I kind of understood, was reluctant, but 6 months ago, he wrote to me and he said, if I came back with my tail between my legs, would the door be open? He said, I made a mistake, and that's thrilling. But boy, he'll pay for it. No, I'm thrilled about that. To get back to your question, were you wondering if there's some restriction or inhibition in the long association?
Kind of the opposite. If writers feel better facilitated to take more risks, take their work in new directions because there's a trusted and sustained relationship with an editor, with a press that supported their work for so long.
Well, the trust is a key word. I mean, I feel humbled by the amount of trust people place in me with their work. But with that, I recognize the responsibility. And we have to keep perspective here. When someone says, wait a minute, you started the Gallery Press when you were 3.5 or whatever it was. You have to remember, whatever the Gallery Press is now, it was not then. I mean, it was a tiny thing. And it just seems I started and kept going, and it grew. And it started to publish younger, newer people. But there were crucial moments, and two of them have to be mentioned, and two people have to be singled. A poet and a playwright whose work was published in England decided they wanted to have an Irish publisher. And the poet was Derek Mahon, and he wrangled for years to get out of contracts with Oxford University Press, and eventually that was sorted. The playwright was Brian Friel, to whom I had written a fan letter soon after I had started writing plays, publishing plays in the 70s. And nobody published plays then. But Faber's in London would publish plays if they were hits, basically. And I wrote to Brian and said how much I admired his work. And if he ever had anything that I might publish. And he offered me an early play, and he said, would you be interested in publishing a selection from his 2 books of stories? And then we started to publish most of Brian's plays here on the opening night of their productions. And the idea that suddenly Brian Friel and Derek Mahon were on the list, and Maeve McGuckian, who had published in England, also moved from Oxford to Gallery. I mean, these were just big moments, and with them, huge responsibilities, and just thrilling satisfactions that followed the friendships that grew. The love I had first for the work and then for the people. The hope has been to maintain that balance between the new and the recent years have been a decimation, pillars of the list. If you take John Montague, if you take Brian, if you take Derek, if you take Kieran Carson, Michael Cody, just people died whose work I'd been publishing for decades, and it looked kind of bleak for a moment, but it happened that I had been working with a number of younger and newer people, and suddenly there was a new life and a new breath and a second life into the list, and I feel excited about it again. I mean, it could have just run out of steam in some way, but it feels refreshed and reinvigorated, and This is only the first 55 years, you understand. Just getting the hang of it, you know.
Yeah. I'd love to dive in a little more into those relationships with the press as writers. And this is a little bit of a sensitive question, but I wanted to ask about how you balance writing with editing. And as a press that's published over 500 books, over 55 years, I'm sure the two sometimes compete with your own creative practice. But I'd like to ask if there are ways in which your practice as a poet has been fed and has evolved through those relationships with the writers you've encountered through the press.
Well, I did single Brian Friel and Derek Mahon, and I remember a day I was going through the mail, and I opened an envelope with familiar script on it, and there was a new play called The Home Place by Brian Friel in it. And I opened another envelope, and there were poems from Derek Mahon in it, The Makings of a Book. And I just thought, I like my job. You know? Sure, there are tiresome aspects to it. But you ask, has it fed? I mean, I've found it. I've loved it. And I don't tire of it. And I get excited about reading manuscripts and hopeful, looking at them. You ask that question about balancing my own attempts at writing poems with the demands of editing or publishing. How do I do that? And the answer has to be badly. And maybe I yield to the editing and publishing more and more, because I'll be honest, people are more interested in gallery books than my books. So, but I've written some poems I'm glad are there. And some translations that I'm glad are there. I used to think I had a perfect balance between my writing life, my publishing life, and for many years I farmed. I kept a flock of sheep and loved that work too. But at a point, the press got bigger, a family came, something had to give, something had to go. I thought the family wouldn't thank me for it, so the flock went. And I miss that. It's a juggling act. And I don't look back, you know, I don't. You say 500 books, and I don't know how many books I've published. I mean, this is awful, and it's not because I have a bad memory. I don't know how many books I've written. because I don't look back. I know people who live in the past, and it doesn't seem to be where I'd want to be. It's too much fun here.
I have just 2 more questions for you before I hand it over to the floor. You say you don't look back, but I'm going to ask you to look back. We touched a little bit on the press's humble beginnings, and I remember once hearing an anecdote that in the early days, would you set up a makeshift office in the Bailey on Duke Street?
No.
No?
Absolutely not true. It was Kyo's in South
Keogh's.
Anstey.
Close.
I used to get mail there. And these were the heady days of a sort of literary life in Dublin when MacNaid's was a centre. MacNaid's forever associated with the poet Patrick Kavanagh and even Brendan Behan, though apparently they would not talk to each other. They'd both be there. I would have some occasions to go over from my office, which was in Keogh's, just 2.5 blocks away, to get poems from Pierce Hutchinson or get poems from somebody who was in there. And I remember hearing from someone that Pierce had said, you know, Peter doesn't take a drink, because I never stayed in MacNaid's to have a drink, but I go straight back to Keogh's. But we won't tell anyone that.
And I guess the other part of my question is, I mean, it seems like it was yourself for a long time, and then now that there's a whole team behind Gallery, Jean and Suella, Anne, there's a premises. You talked about that evolution and certain poets coming on board and feeling like you'd created something that was more established. So I'm just curious to know about those moments where you felt like the press had a real foothold, could expand, and was, you know, kind of solidly on the Irish literary map.
Well, you see, I don't think things like that, but I hear them from other people. And I don't heed them too much because I'm not sure how good that would be for me. But you have to believe me, there really was never a plan. It was one step in front of the other, and things grew. And Jean was a very close friend who started helping when it became more than I could do on my own. And then we married and had family. And I mean, it used to work from a converted garage in my mother's house in Churchtown in Dublin. But I had found a place in North County Meath, a place I saw one day when I was out walking, and I just knew that's the place. Base camp forever. And then as it grew and we were established in Meath, we got premises up the road from it. And suddenly we took on somebody to help. But did I ever imagine I'd be employing people? No. I mean, I almost think that's somebody else in the way that some years ago in the office, a book of mine was in the works and to come out. And suddenly, we were talking about a new book by Peter Fallon, or a new book by Grace, or a new book by Derek Mahon or Brian Friel, or and a new book by Peter Fallon. And Peter Fallon became an author, a different person. And, you know, maybe the employer is a different person too, that I happen to know quite well. Not a good guy.
Hasn't fired anyone yet, at least, that we know of.
Not yet.
Not yet. So we're coming to my last question. I just want to say thank you so much for sharing the history and with so much candor and humor as well. You've touched on this already, but with every new generation, the press publishes new voices and takes risks. I'm thinking of like Maeve McGuckian, who you mentioned earlier, whose work was initially reviewed quite harshly and is now acclaimed. And like the act of standing behind a poet who's as original and experimental as Maeve is. I myself am part of a generation of new gallery poets, including poets who are not of Irish descent or born in Ireland, to be welcomed into the fold. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how new voices have brought lifeblood back into the press, not only recently, but at different moments. And as change is the only constant, what maybe do you see as next on the horizon for gallery?
Well, I mean, you have to know your limitations. And I learned early that I couldn't do everything. So we had to draw lines. And one of the lines seemed to be that we would say we would only publish work by Irish writers. And people would approach us, and we sent submission notes that made this clear. And then the submission would come from someone saying, I know you say you only publish work by Irish writers, but I'm sure you're going to love this. I'm Bulgarian, but I think it's a winner. And you go, what? But we also say we don't publish biographies or children's stories or illustrated histories. And people say, I know you don't publish children's stories, but I've written an illustrated children's history story, and I think you're going to love it, you know? So, but I mean, this is one of the excitements, that the whole question of Irish has changed and broadened. And I mean, it's not for us really to be measuring someone's passport or saying, well, exactly how much are you Irish? I mean, that's for someone to decide. And, you know, it has been, it is part of the new blood that's coming into the press that I think it'll take a long time for someone who's I mean, there are new Irish for whom perhaps English was not a first language. I think it'll take a generation for them to really become part of a literary culture. But if you go to the RHA exhibition around the corner, it's not a surprise to see Eastern European names under the artwork, and because there is a more universal visual language than verbal language, I think. It's just more advanced or more available. But that will come in the next 55.
Great. Peter, I'm so grateful to you. This has been great fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a rare insight. Before, you're not quite out of the hot seat just yet. So before we close, I just wanted to open it up to the floor to see if anybody else has questions they'd like to ask. Yeah, please.
I just wanted to ask, what advice would you give to someone at the start of their career looking to break out into the publishing industry?
Do you mean as a publisher rather
Yes.
than? Well, we're frequently approached by people looking for internships, and it's a regret of mine that it's not something we can entertain. Not that we don't need help, but we don't have room to accommodate someone. And we all seem to be so busy at what we do that I've likened, if you came into the office, you'd think we're all studying for an exam or something. We've our heads down, doing our different things. So we don't really have the time to show someone how they would save us time, and then they'd be gone anyway. It's unfortunate. So I think you have to hope to get a footing or a foothold in a press that is not as streamlined as I'm not sure. I'd say start your own press. Be 18 and start your own press. Boy, that's a completely useless answer, isn't it? Kevin.
Peter, I've always envied you one thing, which is my opinion, my cliche would be all good editors are essentially disliked because they murder people's darlings and they say that's not good enough, you change this, you change that. I fell out with a lot of people because I edited something and they just didn't like it. So you are really annoying because I never heard anybody say a bad word about you as an editor. And I want to know how did you manage to be such because you're quality control and you never publish anything that's not at the standard or whatever. How did you manage to maintain all those personal relationships with some of the best writers in the world over 55 years? When, as I say, most good editors essentially are not. They might be admired, but they're never really liked. But you're a person who's greatly admired, but also greatly liked by the people who work for you and with you. How'd you pull off that?
Well, you're not talking to some of the people I hear about, because this is one of the things that amuses me. There are people who think Peter Fallon's great, and I really want to be published by Peter Fallon. So I send him a manuscript, and he sends it back because I'm still Peter Fallon. But suddenly that person thinks, you know what, Peter Fallon's a dick. And I haven't changed, you know? I've just been doing my thing, but it didn't suit that person. For a while, I was publishing the work of a person who thought the editorial process was a competition. and it was tiresome. But somehow we got through the makings of a few books. And at one point, I remember this person saying, well, the problem is you don't like me. And I remember saying, I don't have to like you. We just have to do good work. And we continued for a while, and then it became impossible. And that's about the worst it's been. There are some people I publish and don't see very much. But there has been the great bounty of crucial friendships with people. I mean, key friendships with people. And there is, I mentioned that trust, and I mentioned that the trust you hope for, and the responsibility that I'm very conscious of. The friendships have been bonuses. Just lucky. It's a charmed life. Please.
I had a question. When you were talking earlier, you mentioned that one of the reasons you may take a poet on or someone is like the promise that
Yes.
should come out of it. I know it's probably a really intangible thing that there's no real measure to it, but I was wondering, are there certain qualities you look for to kind of, indicate promise? Is it like cleverness? Is it like, form? Is it risk-taking? What kind of signals is promising?
Well, let me jump ahead from that promise that there have been several occasions when on someone's third book or fourth book, I've felt, yes, this is what I was, this is the book I was waiting for. And you couldn't send the person away and say, come back with your third book. They wouldn't have got to the third book without the first and second, So, I mean, that is the kind of vindication or validation of my point. What do I, people say, what are you looking for? And it's too easy to say that you hardly know, but you know it when you find it or see it. But my dear friend Seamus Heaney frequently quoted something he says, I said, which I don't remember saying, but I'll take it. He said that I said that I was looking for the credible version of a life in language that is memorable and distinctive. And which might be a way of saying you want someone to be writing his or her or their own poems, not somebody else's. And though there probably will be influences, and there should be probably influences, because there should be, I'm guessing, evidence of exposure to and immersion in the work of other people. I don't think you can do it without reading, without studying, without thinking about. And I get manuscripts from people who have never given a thought to what a poem is or might be or how it might work. What is the machinery of a poem? What is the fuel of a poem? How does a poem work? what might you want it to be, you know? And a lot of people send manuscripts, and they're like people who picked up a fiddle and they want to be in the concert hall, you know? It doesn't work. You know.
Hi. Thank you.
Don't think I was neglecting you.
I'm hiding in the corner, but thank you for talking with us today. Yours seems to be just an incredible story, and I guess being a young person sitting in this chair listening to you talk about this, I'm feeling this sort of tension between, you know, wanting security for your life and trying to figure out how you'll spend the next 55 years of my life, and also knowing that this is a room full of just really passionate students. And I imagine that over the 55 years of Gallery Press, you've probably had some moments where maybe things were really unsure, or you were taking a lot of risks. I mean, thinking about giving your magazines off to someone and hoping that they'd come back with money, or having to make the decision between the family and the flock. What, over these past 55 years, do you think has sustained you most through difficult or unsure or uncertain moments in your career?
Well, you have to understand I was only ever in it for the money. And that didn't work. Things started to happen, as you've had some sense, when, yes, I was young, and the year I graduated from Trinity, after taking the scenic route and spending 8 years there, because, I mean, you couldn't say I'm a publisher, but if you said I'm a student, you can do anything, you know? So it kind of suited me to stay as a perennial student. But the year I graduated, I was invited to go to a school, one of those New England prep schools, for a year as a poet in residence. And I'd found the place in Meath, which I was starting to rent and work on. And I figured if I went to Deerfield for a year, I would have enough money to live in Lough Crew for a year and basically figure out, is this a game? Is this for fun? You know, you get to stay up late and meet people, or is it a life, you know? And in the course, or early in that year, I found myself asking, could I imagine a life without the poems at the center of it? And when I phrased the question, I knew the answer. And you say what sustained me in times of, and there were times that were hard times. I guess it was a faith in the poem and the poems. And some faith in my capacity to read a text and sit with an author and help the text become its best self, which is, or should be, the editor's aim. And I don't think I've ever wavered from those things in the years since. But what I'll do when I grow up, God knows. And you mentioned passion and the passion of your colleagues here, and you know you're fortunate people. But don't betray that passion, you know, ever. And you'll be okay. You'll be okay.
I think those are some beautiful words to end on, but it looks like we have one more question, if we can take.
Ask a question. I was thinking, I think we should end by saying congratulations to Peter and
Stop.
Gary. And what a beautiful and wonderful collection of poets over the years. I mean, and the ones that are still with us. Elaine, you know, probably the best poet, one of the best poets writing in any language, I would say, consistently. I mean, she's just a wonderful poet. And the younger women poets, Grace and Afric and Kay and all those, and all the male poets, I think.
And Peter Sir and
wonderful
Kevin Graham, two are here.
And you've consistently had wonderful taste in poets. So well done.
Thank you, Catherine.
So thank you all so much for joining us on this rainy evening. Thank you again to our host, Notre Dame, for so graciously welcoming us in. And a huge thank you to Peter for giving us some insight and illuminating a little bit of the history of 55 years of Gallery Press. So thank you so much.
You did the work. Thank you.